name is Marla Brown, and I am discussing selective mutism today. So, first and foremost, selective mutism, or SM defined, according to the Selective Mutism Association, quote, selective mutism is an anxiety disorder characterized by a person's inability to speak in certain social settings, such as at school, work, or in the community. So one thing that I do want to clarify, this is an anxiety disorder, but it does have a great impact on students and their ability to interact and partake fully in a classroom setting. When I was first researching this particular communication disorder, I did discover that this is listed in the most common 10 speech disorders, and this was according to speechpathologygraduateprogram.org. So essentially, it's a tool that people use to select their speech pathology programs throughout the United States. So my other interest was piqued as well. My husband has been working with a student and their family. He's going to be an upcoming freshman who has been identified as selective mute. I had never really heard of this communication disorder prior to the spring. And so I wanted to do some more research into this and find out for myself exactly what it entails and how teachers can help students who are selective mute. So here's a video. This is what teachers need to know. Okay, so that was from We Are Teachers. Go back to my presentation. My apologies about that. Okay, so I think some important things in that video as far as selective mutism were really outlined. The idea of what it is and what it is not, especially the idea it's not disobedience. It's not the idea that you are just completely unable to speak. You can speak. You have that ability, but there's certain situations where you're so anxiety induced by speaking that it doesn't work for you. So I think the video does a nice job of really explaining what to do, especially some of the strategies as well, which I'll get into a little bit more later as well. Okay, so signs and symptoms, how to know if a student or somebody that you know might potentially have selective mutism. And again, this is from the Selective Mutism Association. So typically it's diagnosed in childhood, usually ages 3 to 5. When those social situations arise, children are not interacting, they're not communicating. It's more than just shyness. It's not just the shyness, as I've mentioned several times. Other indicators as well, the child will speak freely at home with family. They are engaged at home and they enjoy conversing, and actually they might be very chatty. But when it comes to being around strangers or in public settings, they become nonverbal to the point where they're almost paralyzed with fear. So there's this fear and anxiety. It's this complete shutdown. So you might be thinking, well, this sounds like somebody who's got a fear of public speaking. That is absolutely not the case. So those social interactions are very, very limited. They struggle to make eye contact when uncomfortable. That's another sign as well. Also, they might present themselves as being behaviorally inhibited. So, the idea that they're not able to interact. So, they might present themselves that way. And that's an important point because oftentimes, from my research, what I found is that they might be misdiagnosed as being on the autistic spectrum disorder, on the spectrum. So, they might have that dual diagnosis, or they might be misdiagnosed too. So it's kind of tricky to actually pinpoint select mutism. Other indicators, they use pointing, nodding, writing, and other forms of nonverbal communication to respond to questions. So, for example, in the classroom, rather than speaking out or speaking up to answer a question, they'll nod, they'll write, they'll point to different things. So, again, in that little video that I just shared, I think using those nonverbal cues for students would be very effective with having a selective mute child in the classroom. Also, the buddy system. The buddy system was mentioned in that short video. Some strategies for teachers. Having a trusted individual, a parent, a school friend, somebody at school they feel comfortable with, they will often speak or whisper through that person, their answers or what they'd like to communicate. So having that connection at school is important. I wanted to keep this for last. Typically, what you see with selective mutism is it does typically co-occur with another disorder. Typically, it's social anxiety. As I mentioned as well, autism spectrum disorder as well has been, sometimes it's confused with that. It might be possible, but most of the time it's not autism. So usually this is this anxiety disorder. So really it really comes or stems from social anxiety. Causes of selective mutism. So a lot of it is stress. A lot of it is that social anxiety that is induced with being around strangers, uncomfortable situations. Also, there might be a sudden life change or feeling threatened. So some of those causes in the past, researchers have attributed to trauma. So for example, the death of a loved one, traumatic experience at a young age. But current research suggests that trauma might induce total mutism. It doesn't relate to selective mutism. So remember, with selective mutism, the child is verbal at home. They are able to communicate, but at school, they do not. So those are some of the causes. Common risk factors for selective mutism: history of anxiety or anxiety disorder. So again, as I mentioned before, anxiety is really typically found as an underlying co-occurring diagnosis with this. Another common risk factor: extreme shyness. So this is again going back to those first social play dates. Children ages 3 to 5 is usually where this is diagnosed. They're just not engaging with their peers, right? So that's going to be part of it as well. As I mentioned several times, social anxiety disorder, that is a common risk factor associated with selective mutism. Sensory processing disorder as well. They're not able to intake all of their senses around them, so that is going to be something that will typically, you'll see this as a side effect. Auditory processing disorder. So again, if you think about speech and you think about the ways we communicate, yes, this is an anxiety disorder, but at the same time, you have some issues with how you intake information auditorily. So there's also that attached to it. Also, common risk factors, another one is obsessive compulsive disorder as well. Okay, so how to diagnose? As I mentioned before, this typically, sometimes initially a teacher or a parent might be thinking that it is autism. However, the diagnosis, according to the DSM, 5th edition, to be diagnosed with selective mutism, they must meet the following criteria: consistent failure to speak in specific social situations where there is that expectation for speaking. So despite speaking in other situations. So again, they'll speak at home, but not at school. So that expectation and that stress really is what adds up there. Second, the disturbance interferes with educational or occupational achievement or with social communication. So it can be diagnosed in adults as well. So please be aware of that. The duration of the disturbance, it's at least 1 month. so at least 1 month, but it's not limited to the first month of school. So essentially what that means is you might have a child who comes off as very shy during the first month of school. That's not going to be included in that assessment and that analysis of diagnosis. Again, the next one, the failure to speak is not attributable to a lack of knowledge, comfort with, or the spoken language required in the social situation. So when diagnosing selective mutism, if you have a second language speaker, a non-native language speaker in your classroom, it's not necessarily tied to a lack of understanding of that language. Okay. Then the last one, the fifth criteria to be diagnosed as selective mutism, the disturbance is not explained better by a communication disorder such as stuttering, and it does not occur exclusively during the course of autism spectrum disorder, schizophrenia, or another psychotic disorder. Okay, so that's important to know. Okay, so how do we treat selective mutism? There's approaches to this. There's several approaches. I'm just kind of briefly showing three methods, three treatments that I found in my research. So of course there's CBT. So CBT, it's behavioral and cognitive behavioral strategies. So if you're familiar with that, it's the idea that you have these negative thoughts, right? And it's a cycle. You have these upset feelings, and then it results in this unhelpful behavior. So essentially with CBT, what we're doing is we're breaking that cycle of when you have that negative thought enter your mind, such as, I'm not going to speak because I can't speak, I don't want to speak, I'm really shy, this is going to be horrible and painful. CBT, what that does is it trains you to think differently. So when you have those negative thoughts, you have counter thoughts. So, those unrealistic ideas or ideations that students might have, you would change that into, okay, that can't possibly be true, this isn't going to happen. So essentially it's just retraining your brain how to avoid those negative thoughts and those feelings. Second one is medication. Typically though, for children, in the research that I did, I didn't find exact what type of medication. I think this is more exclusive for adults who have selective mutism, to be quite frank. And of course, speech therapy. So working with a speech therapist to build up that comfort level of actually physically speaking in those uncomfortable situations. I kind of liked this infographic. I guess it's not necessarily an infographic, but just the idea that it's not a form of shyness. It's an anxiety disorder. So even though the child might have a shy personality, it's not a form of shyness. Okay. So also a myth, children with selective mutism also have speech problems. Some do need speech therapy, however, the majority don't. Another myth, children with selective mutism are being stubborn and manipulative. Also, that was something in the video to start with. It's severe anxiety, and it just basically stops that person from talking. So essentially, that's something to keep in mind. It is not a behavioral issue. It's not manipulation of any type. And then also a myth, and I've said this several times, I think, in the presentation, that it is not a form of ASD. So it is not a child that's on the spectrum disorder. They can have both, but the fact is, with selective mutism, they can act differently in certain social situations. But if you look at a child who is on the spectrum, they tend to act the same regardless of the situation, regardless of the context of communication, the social situation they're in, right? So that's something to consider when you think of selective mutism versus autism. So something very important to keep in mind. I really liked this sketch. I found this online. It's actually from a student who has selective mutism. And I just really like how this kind of outlines the idea of like what it feels like to have selective mutism and not necessarily be understood. So again, it's never their choice. It's going back to that idea that they're not being stubborn, and it's not manipulation. It's not a behavior. Also going into the idea of we're not shy or rude either. So yes, they're not being rude. It's just in certain social situations, they're unable to physically speak. So again, I think this is great too. We can't talk in some situations, but we want to. But there's so much more to us. We're often very creative with a love of art or music, very chatty, outgoing, and fun living at home. Um, of average or above average IQ. I think that's good to remember. Great eye for details. Individual, nonconformist, different. They're themselves, and I think that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind with any child is everyone's different. We all learn differently, and we all communicate differently. Also, they're excellent problem solvers and perfectionists too. So maybe that's where some of that anxiety lies as well. Not knowing or not that fear of not having the perfect thing to say. So I think that might be a factor as well. And again, just the idea of gentle, perceptive, thoughtful people with a strong sense of justice, mature, and animal lovers. So I thought this was just a great sketch. I really thought that it kind of personalized the idea of this and individualized the idea of selective mutism for me quite well. And I thought this myth versus fact sheet was quite simple and nice as well. So again, it's not just shyness, it is that anxiety disorder. Okay. So I do have one more video, and this is 8 strategies to support children with selective mutism. I got this from a website called Banter, Speech and Language Pathology. So hopefully there's something in here that will be beneficial and useful for you today.
8 strategies to support children with selective mutism. 1. Focus on what the child can do by developing their skills, talents, and interests. Value the child as a whole person. There is much more to life than just talking. 2. Schedule regular physical exercise to help the child manage anxiety and to boost confidence. 3. In private, acknowledge the child's achievements around talking. In public, praise the child for other non-talking behaviours in the same way you would praise any other child. 4. Wait, don't be too helpful. Encourage the child to have a go or think of ways to simplify tasks to increase success. Don't jump in and save children from opportunities to communicate for themselves. 5. Help the child to see difficult tasks like talking as exciting challenges. Change the language from can't or won't to can't yet. 6. Normalize mistake making. Acknowledge and praise the child for trying new things regardless of outcomes. Encourage practice. 7. Welcome and respond to any kind of communication from the child, including gestures, nodding, drawing, making choices, or helping in different ways. 8. Help the child to build friendships by pairing them up with another child for unstructured play dates or at preschool or school. If you are concerned about a child with suspected selective mutism, have a chat with a psychologist.
Okay, so hopefully there was something within that presentation that you found useful. Okay, so whoops, sorry about
8
that.
strategies.
Okay. And then, of course, there are my sources for my presentation. So I think the one thing to really keep in mind with selective mutism is that the strategies here and the little strategies in the beginning don't force students to speak when they're not ready to, because really this is an anxiety disorder. So hopefully you learned something. Thank you for listening.